Hey everybody, this is Anne and welcome back to Painting Big. Today we got a new color theory episode. I keep coming up with new things to talk about. So let's talk about shadows, choosing shadows for your colors and also mixing shadows for your colors. All right, let's get to it. Alrighty, got all sorts of nice little dots lined up here for you. But first, let's talk a little bit about just choosing shadows and highlights for colors. I'm going to use blues as an example. Obviously, if you want to do things the boring way, we all know how to do that, right? If you have a red, you choose a dark red to shade it. If you have an orange, you choose a darker orange or brownish orange or something like that. If you have a green, you choose a darker green and so on. So there are some caveats to that, though, and I want to just talk about it in the context of like muted versus saturated colors. So what we've got here is a selection of MSP colors, and right away you can probably tell the odd one out, right? Is this grayed out color here, which is ashen blue. So even though this is a lighter blue than this color, maybe you can tell just looking at it, wouldn't be a great shadow for it. And likewise, this color wouldn't necessarily be a great highlight for it. It might actually work. If you were painting with this color and you shaded with this, maybe it would work. So why is that? Well, the reason is that shadows are almost always more muted colors, more grayed out colors than the main color is, right? Because as the shadow comes in, you've got that kind of grayish cast over it. And so it doesn't look generally as vibrant as some of these other colors. And so when you look at using this color to shade this, even though they aren't like great together, your brain might say, oh, well, maybe that would work. Whereas over here, thinking about taking this color and then shading it with something like that, even though this is a darker blue, it doesn't work at all. So if you are going to use a muted color, try to make sure your shadow is more muted than your base or main color. And sometimes you have to look pretty close. Sometimes if it's just a little bit of muting, it doesn't matter as much. The colors won't fight as much, but sometimes it really does throw a monkey wrench in there. So just kind of maybe test your colors next to each other. I always kind of do a swatch. This is on gray paper, but you can see me swatching a couple different colors here to see how they work. I'm using a purple here. I'm doing more of a green here. And then I've got these guys over here. Here I'm using more of a blue. Here I'm using more of a grayish color, a brownish color. Here I'm using more of a saturated color. There I'm using a bit of a desaturated color. So doing little swatches like this just to see what kind of color might mix is a good indicator. Like, this is pretty, but actually this is a more naturalistic color, right? So if I was doing like a dryad or something, I might choose this. Where if I was looking at something like more flamboyant, like Dancer with a green dress, I might choose that instead, right? So you can make those choices based on kind of the character of the model as well. That said, there are a certain number of other tactics to creating shadows for your colors that look good. And artists have been doing this for forever. It's really complex. If you look at shadows in nature, you can see there's some really complicated stuff going on with the color of the light and reflected color and all this kind of thing. We're not going to talk about that today. I might do another video on it. But right now I just want to lay out some simple ways that if you want to start mixing your shadows to see what you can do, just like I showed you on the swatches, you can kind of have guidelines that will keep you out of getting into too much trouble. Now, getting into trouble with color mixing is half the fun because then you learn what works and doesn't work. But nobody likes to waste time either. So let's start with the first kind of general guideline that I want to talk about. And that is, it's going to require a color wheel or just an imagination. Most of us can remember the order of the rainbow, right? So the first tactic you can use is to understand that blue, violet, and purple, these colors, these bluish colors here are the darkest pigments. And they're also the coolest, and they tend to pull the eye of the viewer away. So that's what you want, right? You want people to kind of ignore your shadows. You want them to look at your bright colors. So when you are looking for a shadow, one technique is to choose the color shifting toward those dark pigments. So if you are looking at, you'll notice yellow, for example. Yellow you could shift either way, right? Blue and violet are directly over here. You could shade your yellow with green, or you could shade your yellow with orange. But when you start getting further along on either way on the other side of yellow, there's an obvious way to shift, right? So you go to your yellow-green, then you're going to be looking at maybe shading with a teal. If you look at your orange, you're probably going to be shading with a red. like I did on Lava Dragon here. You can see how his orange shades down into a red. Now, doing that sort of thing does tend to give you more of a magical fantasy effect. So shading your greens with blues, shading your blues with purple, shading your reds with purples or your oranges with red, it all tends to be, it gives you a very fantasy appearance because it's not the way that natural shadows actually work. So that said, it can give you some beautiful effects. So definitely don't be afraid to experiment with that. And best of all, it doesn't require you to mix. So if you are really kind of like on mixing, this can be easy. You'll be like, oh, well, I can just choose, this orange to shade this yellow. It should work okay. And it will work okay. It'll be fine. You do want to watch the value of the color. For example, obviously, if you've got this red up here, this purple is actually a little bit light. So it wouldn't be a good shadow. You'd have to find a darker purple. So, all right, now let's talk about like some art speak. Oh no, not the art speak. Yes, okay, so here's another one. And many of you have probably heard of this one as well. And this is very much an artist technique. And the way we do it here is we are going to be mixing. Although sometimes once you do a little mix, you can kind of find a color that would work the same way and just use that. But you're going to be mixing your complementary colors together. So if you are painting a red, then if you want to build a shadow, you're going to grab some of your green. And you can use a darker green than this. I just grabbed a bunch of like stuff that was out of my palette. But if I mix my green into the red, oh, it makes this beautiful dark red. Look at that. And once you see that color, you might go, oh, hey, that looks a lot like cobalt scale. So I could probably shade my red with cobalt scale. Or, maybe that color looks a lot like Asmodeus red. Yeah, that's actually almost a perfect match. Look at that. So that's a Pathfinder color from Master Series. And so, okay, I could definitely shade this red with Asmodeus red. This is brilliant red, by the way. So sometimes you can use this as a guide and go, oh, all right, well, because a lot of times when you're mixing complementary pigments in, the color you end up with is a color, like, there's so many miniatures paint colors out there, right? Chances are there's going to be something out there that more or less matches the color you just mixed. And if you can identify it, then you can just go ahead and use it. So let's just do a few other quick examples to show you guys that this really does work. And it's pretty easy. So orange, oh, very see-through. Got a little bit too much water in my palette. Orange with a little bit of blue. That tends to go a bit green. So when you see that, what's happening is the blue pigment is much more powerful than the yellow and red that make up the orange. So you have to keep mixing orange in. And eventually you end up with a brown. There we go. So you end up with an orange brown, which you could use. It's not the prettiest color in existence, unlike the red, but it's not terrible either. Hold on, I'm going to throw a black base in here so you guys can see the actual color. But yeah, but it's perfectly workable. Like, it'll definitely be a muted color, but a lot of people do shade their oranges with brown, and this is why. Remember also, this is going to give you, because it's muting, it's going to look a little bit more naturalistic of a color as well. So let's go to our yellow and our purple. And that actually, because our yellow is more of an orangey yellow and our purple has a fair amount of red in it, it's actually giving us a little bit of an orangey brown color. There we go. So that's a little bit too purpley, but if we continue to mix the yellow in, we get actually a dark yellow. Actually, that's a really nice color, and I've used this color to shade yellows a lot of time. It almost looks like a yellow ochre when you finally get down to it. So that's a very realistic shadow for a yellow. Now let's do our green. Green and red are always kind of the magical ones. They're kind of odd. So we've got our green. This is Naga green. And I'm going to grab a little bit of our red. Usually green and red gray each other out. So I'm imagining this is going to go a grayish, brownish green. And again, the red is kind of taking over. There we go. So we got that coming in. It's muck right now. So when you get mud, just keep going. Push through your mud. It just means you've reached that balance point where the pigments are just interfering with each other and neither one is a clear winner. But here we go. So we have a soft kind of foresty green here. And if the color doesn't look too clear to you, you can actually grab a tiny bit of white just to kind of see what color it really is. So dark colors sometimes can be hard to see, but you can see once you add the white in, this is kind of a, it's almost like a grayed olive. It's a soft mossy green color. So that's the dark version. And you could also just use this color and shade with that. There's all sorts of, once you get into mixing, you can have a lot of fun with this. We'll do quick, we'll do the blue. Blue will seem counterintuitive because orange is lighter, quote unquote, than blue. But when you add that color in, you end up shifting it. So I'm gonna mix that. So it's made more of a gray. And here is where we have broken down. And it is because there's so much yellow pigment in the orange. So let's talk about this really quick. This is a color mixing thing. Oranges are almost all yellow. Like, because you take, and if you've ever tried to mix an orange, you know this. You need a tiny amount of red to go and make a yellow into an orange. So what happens then when we try to do the complementary thing is that the yellow makes it too green, right? The yellow and the orange. That's why when we do this, we get green. And whenever you see this, the answer is actually either to grab a more reddish orange or to grab a little tiny bit of actual red and mix that in. The red counteracts the green and creates a darker blue, which you then can use. So that color right there. So you could use that to shade. It's ugly. I won't deny that. This is not my favorite way to mix shadow for blue. We're also running into the fact that this blue actually has white in it. This is dragon blue. So that's also keeping us from getting a nice dark color. Remember, the blue pigments are actually the darkest pigments. There's one that's almost pure. We'll talk about that in a second. And then we've got our purple and yellow. Again, that's going to give us a brownish color. And again, this purple does have white in it, so we are running into that issue. So instead, let's make an actual darker purple, shall we? So you can see, though, that's what we're running into. It's muting it, but it's not really darkening it because it's fighting that white pigment. So instead, let's come up here, grab our Sea Dragon and our Burgundy Wine. And if those guys got together and had a kid, it would be a nice dark violet color. And if we then grab some yellow and use that to mix in, we're going to get a convincing dark yellow. And if we added a tiny touch of white to bring this color up to what it really is, like so. And then we added some yellow to that. It's going to make more of a grayed out color. But it's going to darken it incrementally. So let me get this next to the color originally. So you could use that as a shadow for this, and this was made with these two colors and that. So yeah, so now you're seeing a couple of the things about mixing, right? When you're using pigments that are less than pure, when you're using paints that are less than single pigment or dual pigment at the very most, you end up, when they have white or black in them, you end up getting a lot of a muckier result. Whereas when you are dealing with colors that are more pure, this is ultramarine blue essentially, and this is close to an alizarin crimson as far as artist paints go, then you get results that actually look a lot more realistic. And that's why a lot of people will tell you to start by mixing single pigment paints, because it's so much easier. You don't have to control for all those other factors. But that's also what makes miniatures paints so hard to mix with, right? Because they do have other pigments in them. Very few of them are single pigment paints. And so then you're dealing with stuff that has white added, black added, 5 different pigments in it. And that's going to kind of muck with your results. That said, you see that I did get usable results in the majority of my tests here, especially when dealing with the colors that are lighter on the color wheel. Now, there are a lot of people who honestly, when it comes to blue and purple, will just add black. And those are the two colors you could be forgiven for just adding black for and just using a very dark version of that color. I personally actually like to just add brown liner, and I'll show you guys how that looks. This is a little trick I use if I want to create a natural shadow. Brown liner is a very dark black brown. It's a liner color with MSP, which means it's a little more fluid out the gate, and it's meant for dark lining. But I actually like it as a general shader. And the reason is that I can use it to create a good color, a good shadow color for pretty much anything. Only yellow will sometimes give me a problem. So let's get my orange over here. We can turn that into a nice brown. Yellow. That's going to turn me into that's going to be a greenish shadow. But that's the way shadows in nature go. If you ever look at a lemon, you're going to see the shadow color looking more like this. Like, especially if you're looking at paintings, look at how they mix the shadow for the lemon. It's going to look a lot like this. Still lifes and stuff like that. Okay, so for green, brown liner, just going to just make a soft grayed out green, which is a great dark color. The blue, again, we're going to be up against the fact that this blue has a fair amount of white in it, but this time, with just using brown liner, we can mix a decent shadow right out the gate. And purple, same thing. So yeah, sometimes when I want a more natural shadow, but I don't want to mess around with complementary mixing, I do find that brown liner is the answer, especially with paints where I'm not sure like what kind of other pigments they might have in them. I find that the brown liner works just fine to create a darker color. And so there you go. So those are the easiest ways that I know to mix shadow colors or to find shadow colors. And once again, as you look here, you might say, oh, this is really close to like russet brown or harvest brown. Then you know that you can use those colors then to shade your orange, right? So the more familiar you are with the paints that you've got, the more you can use just little spot mixes like this on your palette to like say, okay, so that's a good shadow for yellow. It looks great. Oh, what color do I have that looks like this, right? This looks like yellow ochre. Okay, I'm going to use that. This looks like jungle moss. I'm going to use that. And you can do that, right? You can even get those colors out and kind of like dab them down and see which ones look best. Like, that's really the way to not get in trouble with your shadows, is to just sit down and play around a little bit and look at them next to the color that you're going to be using on the palette. Maybe mix them with that color and see what kind of shadow they create, and then what that color looks like by itself. All right, guys, this was a shorter one. I'm glad. I've been going entirely too long with videos lately. I'm going to probably do another one of these because there's more advanced stuff about how to mix shadow colors. And I tend to use those more advanced techniques when I'm trying to create something like a lighting effect that I need to look real. All right, so we'll talk about that next time. Otherwise, I hope you had fun. I hope this makes sense to you. And I'll see you around. This is Anne signing off.